days have attacked Pearl Harbor by air.
Ask not what your country can do.
President Kennedy has been shot.
One small step for man.
We choose to be self-evident that all men are created equal.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Pier 54, New York City. On May the 1st, 1915, 2,000 passengers boarded one of the fastest, most luxurious ships in the world, the Lusitania.
She was simply a wonderful, steady ship. She had 4 red funnels, and she was a beautiful sight to see. She really was.
Eda Stanley and her family were heading home to England and into the midst of the most brutal conflict man had ever experienced. The First World War was almost a year old, and any transatlantic crossing was made potentially dangerous by the presence of German submarines. Still, the passengers felt safe. After all, the Lusitania was a passenger ship. On her last day at sea, the Lusitania was approaching the Irish coast.
It was 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and you could see all this coastline. It was a beautiful day, couldn't have been any better. And then bang! It was a terrific bang. Dad knew what it was. I mean, that he knew darn well it was a torpedo.
The single German torpedo did such damage that the Lusitania could launch only 6 of her lifeboats before she went down.
We could not take the people in that were begging to be taken in. I mean, we would have capsized and everybody would have gone. 1,200 drowned, didn't they? I think it was 1,200 drowned. More drowned than were saved.
Among those who drowned were 128 Americans. The memory has faded for all but a very few, some of whom you'll hear from. But because it has affected so much of what has happened since, the bulk of this program is about the First World War, the Great War, they called it. It began in June of 1914 with the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary. He was shot by a Serbian nationalist in Sarajevo. Ferdinand had governed in a circle of European royalty that also included the King of England, the Tsar of Russia, and the Kaiser of Germany. And together, their colonial empires dominated most of the Earth's population. And when the competitive Kaiser seized upon the assassination as a pretext to begin a European war, he found the other royals only too willing to go along. All of them sought to widen their influence. None could possibly realize how radically they were about to alter the course of the 20th century. In the summer of 1914, the generation that would fight the First World War was enthusiastic about doing so. Those young men who were so quick to answer their nation's call to arms had no reason to anticipate the hell ahead. In the German city of Koblenz, 12-year-old Joachim von Elbe began a diary.
August 5, 1914. The city is full of soldiers. They were singing this song, on, to fight, we are born, on, to fight for the fatherland. To Kaiser Wilhelm, we have sworn, to Kaiser Wilhelm, we give our hand.
The optimism of the Germans was matched by their allies in Austria and by their enemies in Russia, in France, and in England.
As soon as I enlisted, I was in a crowd of other 18, 19 and 20-year-olds, and we thought it was going to be a tremendous lark to go and knock the Kaiser off his throne, you see.
Everyone thought the war would be over at Christmas. And I really badly wanted to get to France to get in the fighting.
The Germans attacked first, and very quickly they were through Belgium and into France. The romantic notion of war that so many young men carried into battle was very quickly shattered. The new weapons of war were so ferocious that by the end of the first year, French casualties alone would approach 1 million men.
Nobody in Europe expected these appalling casualties. And when they came, they were utterly crushing. The first dreadful experience was that of the victims of what was called the Massacre of the Innocents in Germany. These boys from high school or college who were given a couple of months' training and sent off to the front, and who died in tens of thousands in a few weeks. Nothing like that had ever happened before to any country in Europe. And moreover, this was the flower of German youth. They were the best educated young men. They were from middle-class families almost exclusively. And they had no expectation at all that this terrible thing was going to happen.
Americans had never dreamed that a war on the other side of the ocean could affect them. The U.S. was officially neutral, and most of its citizens assumed it would stay that way.
People were going about their own business, object being to make money, good business. Everything was very pleasant indeed.
It's hard for people who weren't there then to realize how enormously the world has changed. On New Year's Day, President Wilson had open house at the White House. And you could go down, we went down once, I was a little kid, I was taken along, went down and stood in a little queue, and it moved up and we all went through and shook his hand. Shook hands with the President on New Year's Day.
But certainly America was changing. The pace of life was quickening. Almost overnight, Henry Ford's historic assembly line had lowered the cost of making cars, as well as the cost of buying them. The mass-produced Model T came in one color, black. But at $295, it was the first car priced within reach of ordinary Americans.
We played baseball in the streets, and there was no problem playing baseball when horses and wagons dominated the traffic. It only became a problem when automobiles and trucks came in.
So much in America was changing as Europe went about its ugly war.
At this first movie that I attended, I recall the scene where there was a great deal of shooting. As they came to the front of the screen and the figures got larger and larger, and I thought they were coming at me, and I started screaming so badly that they had to take me out of the movie house.
As movie-making techniques improved, movies became an American obsession, and it was in the movie houses that Americans were exposed to the war in Europe. In the movie house, it still seemed glamorous.
We went every Saturday morning and just devoured the pictures of the war. Beautiful uniforms, the dashing mounted cavalry with their flashing sabers in the sun riding into battle, and oh, I thought that would be something else. I was just aching to go.
The movies were the perfect proving ground for the new art form called propaganda. Americans saw and soon sympathized with the British view of the Germans. By early 1915, the war in Europe was good for America. U.S. banks were lending huge amounts of money to Britain and France, who in turn used the money to buy arms from American factories. With the war, Americans were in the greatest economic boom in their history.
During the war, everybody worked. Before the war, my father brought home $6 or $7 a week. Now he brought home checks for $100, $110 a week. It was like bringing home a check for $1 million.
The war had another effect. It virtually cut off European immigration to the United States, causing a labor shortage in American factories. And that forced northern employers to look for the very first time at the substantial black labor pool of the American South.
Black newspapers who went down south and told them, come on up to Chicago with us. We'll get you a job and take care of you. You don't have to stay down here and be lynched and burned.
My relatives, aunt, uncle, cousins, came north. We were able to get into factories and steel mills, jobs that just wouldn't have been available to blacks under normal circumstances.
This great migration from the South kept America's economy strong and vigorous, while the increasing economic stake in Britain and France encouraged greater support for their war against the Germans. But the war was not going well, and the idea that Americans might yet have to be involved was now an issue. All over the United States, with the support of former President Theodore Roosevelt, potential volunteers began to train for battle. By Christmas 1914, the armies of Europe had completely bogged down, and fighting had spread to Russia, Africa, and the Middle East. The empires drew on their colonies for manpower. 60 countries were eventually represented in the conflict. The Germans had expected to win in 42 days, but they had not anticipated what would happen on the Western Front in France. On the Western Front, the German assault had finally failed, and soldiers on both sides had raced to dig an elaborate trench system that stretched for 300 miles from the English Channel all the way to Switzerland. On New Year's Day in 1915, the young men who had gone off to fight glorious battles were now trapped in a desperate war of attrition.
Someone said to us excitedly, "Jack Smith." I said, "What about him?" "He's dead. He's been shot. The first one."